to the virtual study of the Constitution and civic responsibility on inquiry into American origins and evolving institutions. Director of the Virtual Center, Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I usually say welcome to the Wednesday edition, but it's been so long since we've had an edition that I thought the best thing to do would be to skip the mention of Wednesday, at least at the beginning, and just welcome you to the Virtual Center and to let you know that it's been too long since we have on a program. I've gotten a few emails during the period, and a couple of listeners have referred to the fact that there's been no program as late August hiatus. And I guess a good way of saying it is anyway. I did plan a trip, a week-long trip, to visit a life friend, 50 years, in Florida. And as the trip became closer and closer, as it became more closer for the time to leave, I became a little bit intimidated by the drive. I guess maybe it's a function of age. I don't know, but I've made that over the years. I can't tell you how many times. But each time it's a little bit more for me, and I was a little bit skittish about taking on that kind of a trip by myself anymore. I travel with my wife, and we travel together, and everything's fun. But kind of the thought of 20 hours on the road by myself, to be very honest with you, since I've been doing the virtuals, I've gotten into the 18th century. I find that if I'm behind the wheel for any extent of time, my mind starts to the 18th century, and I literally forget that I'm behind the wheel. And the more I thought about that, and the more I kept thinking, this is maybe a little bit more than I ought to take on. So I called my friend in Florida, and we talked. I called him 3 times during that period, and told him that I had thought better of it, and he was quite understanding, and told me, in all honesty, that he wouldn't, as much as he'd like to see me, he wouldn't take that kind of a trip on coming up this way any longer either. So I think we've reached kind of a plateau where I'm going to have to really rethink trips like that. But anyway, since we had pretty well announced that we canceling the program period, and since there were a couple of other things on tap for Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On, we kind of thought, well, maybe the best thing to do is just kind of let it go and miss the week. As I had mentioned on the Facebook page, I had intended to begin our program yesterday, but I honestly did incur a scheduling conflict yesterday. I don't have all any appointments anymore, but I did have one yesterday. And I thought I could probably make it by perhaps lopping off the last 15 minutes to 20 minutes of the program. And in talking to Bob and the realization that we really hadn't programmed for a long time, I didn't want to do that on the very first program back. So we decided to postpone the return of the Virtual Center from yesterday today. So here we are on this, I believe it's the 9th day of September in the year 2015. It's the first program, and this on Facebook this month. I just marvel at the fact that it's true. This is the first program of the 31st month of the Virtual Center. We began on March 11th, 2013. And so we have just passed the 2.5-year period, and now we're entering into the last 6 months of the third year here at the Virtual Center. I absolutely believe that we've been doing it for that long, and that I've enjoyed, and I really hope that you have as well. I've missed the material. In fact, you'll find out very quickly that I didn't get too far away from the material. But I have missed the Virtual Center, and I have missed the challenge, if you will, of coming on the air 3 times a week and literally taking on some of these issues. I've been kind of collecting contemporary issues as well. I'm very, very conscious of this religious issue that's been going on in Kentucky over the issuing of marriage licenses. I find that one almost laughable, except for the fact that it isn't funny, because there are so many people that subscribe to this view. It's extremely dangerous, and all I've been able to think about is James Madison and Thomas Jefferson would roll in their graves if they saw that protest crowd yesterday outside the jail in Kentucky with Huckabee, raising their arms toward skies as if some sort of victory had been won. And in fact, what really is happening is the potential threat to the solution of the republic, and these people have no idea. And in essence, by taking the issue of religious freedom, they take it. They are endangering the freedom of everybody else. They don't seem to realize it. And I have seen comments from prominent leaders, the veterans, who have pointed out the absurdity of the position, of the idea that you can take a position with public responsibilities, that you can bring your beliefs onto your job and impose them on other people and on people's rights under the Constitution as a result. I found that incredibly disturbing. I especially find it disturbing because I know that Madison and Jefferson would as well. They both had incredible in 1786 in the state of Virginia. 4 the constitutional, and they were in Virginia, and they were basically arguing for the separation of state and religious rights as only to govern a diverse population from throughout. That principle not changed, despite what some of these believe. I do want to get into the 18th a little bit. Mainly, it's been a couple of weeks program, and I kind of reorient us to the principal mission of the Virtual Center. So let me begin by telling how happy I am to be here, privileged, how blessed I am to have the opportunity to be with you on a regular basis like this. There's no way that I can express my gratitude to Bob Kincaid and to the folks at the Head On Radio Network for this opportunity. Like everybody else, I look forward to the day that the doorbell will ring and the mailman will have a package for me, and in that package will be word that I have won a fortune. Because one of the things that I would do with such a fortune is to endow the Head On Radio Network, so that its essential problems would dissipate, at least for a time. All I can think of is it's not too often in today's world that committed folks are able to do so much with so few resources on which to rely. And for better than 8 years, the Head On Radio Network has done it. I think it's admirable. I think it's needed. And I thank all of you for your continued input, for the efforts of Head On, and for your support, Virtual Center. We do solicit your input, your ideas, your suggestions. And indeed, there might be some having a little bit of difference, remembering exactly what we did in our last program together. And I have a piece here that I kind of have the feeling that I might have shared portions of, but I'm hoping the 2 weeks that have lapsed in the interim might create an opportunity to represent some of this stuff, bring it up to date, bring it to the front door, and proceed accordingly from there. Again, we do have a phone number. We do encourage calls, participation in the program. I invite you to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-676. 304-634-676. Address, if you'd like me directly and share your ideas with me via email, my email address is aobrien6 WAOBRIEN906 WAOBRIEN906 email.com. And you again that we do page. It's at pretty well dormant week. Put a couple of things on it recently. And I do encourage you to check on some of the material that's on there. There's not that much, but there are a few articles or portions of articles that really do kind of summarize or bring together some of the conversations, some of the ideas that we've had here on the Virtual Center. I would like to see the Facebook page serve as kind of a compendium or an element in one's ability to review some of the highlights and some of the things we've spent our most profitable time on here at the Virtual Center. So if you go to Facebook and if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will get to the page. And I do look forward to your reaction to some things that are on. I've over the last couple of weeks, with most recent, obviously, rather dormant since we haven't been actively involved in our program. But I have kind of seen the book page as an opportunity to alert people on a regular basis to what the topics of the day will be, so that we can maybe use the Facebook page as a way to encourage additional listeners to tune in to meetings here at the Virtual. Again, what's the edition, September 9th, 15, Virtual Center. I'd like to mention that, even though there was a hiatus, so to speak, I never got too far away from the 18th century. I started since we were last. Ideas I have written two of them that I have submitted to our statewide paper here that over the last 13 or 14 months, I would guess that probably the Gazette has probably printed 10 to 12 pieces that I've put together. Most of them related to the 18th century, some of them contemporary. I can remember the one on the Greek debt crisis, for example, to be specifics, and a couple of pieces on the Common Core and on West Virginia's determination to separate its schools from the Common Core standards. But many of them have been on the 18th century, on the Constitution more specifically. And in the last couple of weeks, I've really returned to the idea, to the relationship between the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the Constitution of the United States in 1787. That's kind of where we were, I believe, when we interrupted our regular programming for the last week and a half or so until since late August. So I'd really like to pick up there. And about 2 weeks ago, just about that we stopped our programs, I submitted a piece to the Gazette that sits there. It hasn't been published. Part of the reason, I believe, is because I did have a piece published before I submitted this piece. So, and I know that it is policy at the Gazette, as it is in many papers, not anything from the same person more than once every 30 days, something like that. So I didn't expect this piece to be published any soon. So and in the interim, since I sent this about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, I have completed another piece, and I have not submitted it as yet, but I really don't want to submit it until the first one appears. But both of these deal with the Declaration and the relationship between the Declaration of Independence of 1776 and the Constitution, the product of the convention that met, as you know, of 1780 in Philadelphia. I mentioned this because I think it's very important before we add into this material. I think it's very important to recognize there are 11 years of history between the issuing of those two documents. The reason I say that is because it is a significant movement among conservatives to link directly to documents. The Constitution of the United States is related to and a product of the philosophy expounded by Jefferson in the Declarations. Indirectly, that relationship is valid. But a direct relationship and the implication that the second document, the Constitution, is a direct response to the first one, is to deny the reality of 11 years of history. The committee focused principally on foreign affairs, namely to try to find ways and plan strategies to integrate the economy of the newly declared independent nation in the economies of Europe. In other words, to make the newly independent nation a player in the affairs of the world at large. I think a lot of people overlook that third committee, because the third committee John Adams. So I think it's important to recognize that that exists. But what I'd like to emphasize today are the results of the other two committees. The committee to draft the Declaration, as we know, was comprised of 5 members of Congress, among whom, of course, among those 5, of course, was John Adams and Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. And I feel like Governor Perry in the debates in the election of 2012, because I can't remember the 5th one. But anyway, there were 5. The other committee was charged by Congress to draft a frame of government. That committee was chaired by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. John Dickinson was a leader in the conservative wing of Congress. And by conservative, I mean those who were most reluctant to declare independence. The frame of government drafted in 1776, which became the Articles of Confederation, was drafted by a committee chaired by the most conservative anti-independence person in the Congress, John Dickinson. The reason I say that is because one would expect that the product of that committee, the frame of government drafted by that committee, would lean in the direction of conservatism. And more specifically, I think it's important to recognize what leaning towards conservatism would mean in that context. It appears that while there were many reasons why members of Congress opposed independence and tried everything they could come up with to postpone a Declaration of Independence, while there were many reasons for that, fears of the mother country, fears of trade, of economic loss as a result of no longer being a member of the empire, fears of the power of the British Army, the greatest army in the world, fears of the loss of the protection of British troops in the West against the Indians and in the North against Canada and the French. There's no question that a major reason why people opposed independence was because they feared the actual implementation of the philosophy of independence that Jefferson articulated in the Declaration of Independence. Namely, that government was created by the consent of the governed. Government's purpose was limited to the protection of man's unalienable rights, to include the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that in order to protect these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And whenever government becomes abusive of this charge, whenever government tries to claim more power than the people who created it were willing to give it, then Jefferson says the people have not only the right to overthrow that government, but the duty to do so, and to create a new government that would adhere to the terms for which it was created. Many people within Congress were conservative people. They were prominent people. Not all of them. It wasn't like the Constitutional Convention. But it was in that direction. And what I mean is there were very many prominent people in the Congress. These were not radicals. These were not flaming radicals out to destroy legitimate government and to create chaos. These were people that believed in order and stability, in the idea of the rules of law. They believed in the ideas of justice. And many of them feared that if you ever actually did what the Constitution, what the Declaration of Independence said that men have the responsibility to do, you would be creating a precedent. You would be legitimizing the popular overthrow of legitimate government. And all hell would break loose. There would be chaos, disorder, violence. Thomas Hobbes' state of nature would break out. Because these people believed that it was stable, well-structured government that was responsible for order and legitimacy and stability and predictability within any society. And these people feared that there were people in the population who owned nothing, who had nothing to lose by change, who were willing to take risks, to gamble, because they had no chips in the game. They had no skin in the game, so to speak. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain by change. These conservative members of Congress were people who were very skeptical of change. It was not that they were totally opposed to change necessarily, but they figured that it had to happen very slowly and very carefully, and it should be implemented over time, so that if there was a mistake being made, people would have time to correct it. That's why the Continental Congress, especially the First Continental Congress, was willing to issue plea after plea to the king and to the British government to back off. These people were complaining, were saying to London that there are people here within the colonies for whom nothing less than a total severance of connection with the mother country, independence, is their goal. And what Parliament is doing in some of its most insidious legislation passed to regulate the colonies is playing right into the hands of these radicals who are in the process of whipping up support for independence. And so these conservatives tried over and over again to appease the king, to beg the king. I can remember when I was in school memorizing for an exam the name of something called the Olive Branch Petition. And I think all of us know what it means to extend the olive branch. And what you are doing is saying, I'm willing to put most of the chips in the pot if you'll back off. And still the king wouldn't back off. That's the only legitimate explanation I see that can explain why a nation was at war, why the colonies were at war for more than a year before Congress was willing to declare it. Concord and Lexington were in April of 1775. April 19th was the date that the British evacuated Boston. Yet the Declaration of Independence, the resolution proposed by Richard Henry Lee, is not passed until June 7th, 1776. Some 14 months later. When has a nation, has a people been actually at war with people dying and still not willing to declare the reality of the existence of that war? And so the question, it seems to me, that everybody must face is, what were they afraid of? And what they were afraid of is the breakdown, literal breakdown of the culture, of the society that they lived in. They were afraid that they would be living in chaos. That with the severance of the connection from England, all order would be gone. No laws would be enforced. The jails would empty. People would be raping and stealing and pillaging all over the place. And there'd be no power, no army that could stop them. Consequently, these more conservative members of Congress believed, once it became very clear that there was no way to stop or to block independence, these folks believed that the only thing you could do if independence was inevitable is to make sure that England was replaced by a government that was strong enough to preserve order. You could not risk 13 independent colonies with no sense of order, no sense of commitment, no sense of responsibility to each other. You could not expect it to survive. That then is the challenge of the committee chaired by John Dickinson. And John Dickinson is probably the epitome of those who believed this way. Consequently, when the first draft of what is called the Articles of Confederation is presented to Congress by that committee, expectations are that the Articles of Confederation is going to call for the creation of a very strong central government. There's a problem with that. The problem is that many people believed if we're fighting a war against the oppression of a government that violated the principles of republicanism, that violated the so-called social contract, the contract between government and the people that created it, why in God's name would we turn around and create a government as strong as that? Isn't that testimony to the fact that strong central government is to be avoided at all costs? That doesn't mean that these people were radicals. It doesn't mean that if they were opposed to strong central government, that necessarily translates into the fact that they were radicals who wanted no government at all, who wanted chaos, who wanted a return to something like what Locke and Hobbes called the state of nature, where man was totally free to do whatever he wanted to do. These were still conservative people. They just felt that it was suicidal to go to war and risk life and limb to secure your independence from a strong government and then turn around and create another one. These people were committed Republicans, small r. We can't say that anymore today because I can't tell with 17 candidates. It's hard to tell what a committed Republican is anymore. It depends on who's on television at the particular time. But these people were committed Republicans in the philosophical sense. They were supporters and advocates of Montesquieu and Montesquieu's description of Republican government in his Spirit of the Laws. Montesquieu felt that the only way that a republic could work is if the area to be governed was small. In order to be successful, Republican government had to be small. The idea being that if it was small, then the people would know the elected representative, would know their representatives, and the representatives would know the district, would know the needs of citizens. And that kind of interaction, that reciprocal back and forth between government and the people, Montesquieu argued, was the basis of successful Republican government. Consequently, these states' writers, I guess you could say, these people that were suspicious of national government, advocated the independence of each colony. They advocated the creation of union, but it was not a union that set up government over all the states. It was rather a union of independent sovereign states. And at the very outset of the Articles of Confederation, Article 1, they described this government as a league of friendship among free sovereign states. They were not radicals. I'm sure there were some. There were probably a couple that believed that the best thing we could do is just kind of scratch it all and go back and start all over again. But most of these people were sensible, stable, kind of conservative people. And their idea was that if you created a structural republic within the state, a government that was stable, a government that could call out the militia when it was needed, that if you had well-ordered, well-structured government on the state level, you didn't need to risk an authoritarian central government. So the struggle in Congress, the debate within Congress over the Articles of Confederation, ended up to be between what we would call today states' writers and nationalists. The most conservative, and I hate to say this because they were all conservatives, really. They were planters and attorneys and businessmen and merchants and shipbuilders, and there were representatives of the backcountry that represented small farmers and stuff. But generally speaking, the bulk of the Continental Congress was right of center, we would say, in political science terms. And then out came the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles specified in detail the powers that the governments of each state would have in this republic. State governments were given the power to conduct elections, to schedule elections, to set up the requirements for candidates for office. State constitutions were encouraged to specify property qualifications for voting and office holding, which was generally considered to be a very important phenomenon for preserving cultural order. The people that owned the most were the people that qualified for the most important offices. That was the principle. And the states were given power to raise militias. They were given power to tax. They were given powers to do such and such. And so the reality is that the only powers the states were willing to give to the central governments were the powers necessary for a league of friendship to function. Congress then, for example, Congress, which was a Congress of all the states, Congress was given the authority to conduct foreign affairs, to deal with the Indians, to regulate, to regulate trade with other nations and these kinds of things. But Congress was not given the power over the states. In fact, the central government was denied specific powers of the central government. Was denied the power and was require states and the federal government with money to function felt it necessary. Then they had to require the central controlled Miller without the issue of a well under the Constitution. Declared all powers to expressly reserved to the state. The states' rights in 1776, all interpretation, that these people, they were Republican government in order to be were committed to the idea power had to be in the states. Power was in the legislature. Powers of governors very suspicious with royal government because the agents of parliament will. They were the people that actually carried out the horrendous legislation that was coming out of Parliament. So consequently, these colonies became very, very suspicious of the executive branch of government, of the powers of institutions, was severely limited. Government were made of Congress. Power was consistent with most in the branch of government closest people that gave government the power. People. It seems to me the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution of the United States, philosophy, it was the Constitution as the Declaration. Thinking of Congress also at that time, it is to try the Constitution of the United States principally to implement the philosophy that's under the article Madison articulated in 1786, made it necessary to revise the Articles of Confederation. And convention met, Governor Randolph and Madison and some of the other leading conservatives in the Constitutional Convention made the case that the Articles was so impossible, was so deficient, that the only thing that Congress could do was to scrap the Articles entirely and come up with an entirely new frame of government. And it's at that point that Governor Randolph of Virginia, who opens the convention, distributes copies of Madison's Virginia plan, the plan for a strong central government to replace the weak central government of the Articles of Confederation. So one could argue that whatever the Constitution felt it needed to do in order to fix the problems of the nation under the Articles, it had to do so without violating the principle of the Declaration of Independence. But to say that the Constitution was created to implement the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is really a stretch. Because the very existence of the Articles of Confederation validates the fact that that was the government that best reflected the philosophy of the Congress at that time. I think that's a very, very important principle and an important background, if you will, to looking at both documents. The second thing that I would say about this is that the Constitution of the United States was written to implement the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is to imply that the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence was really the principal part of the document. That the so-called philosophical paragraph, the early paragraph in the Declaration, which basically lays out the idea that man was endowed by his creator with unalienable rights, and among these was the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and God was made to protect his rights. And if government ever stepped the legitimate limits for which it was, then the people had not only the responsibility, not only the right, but the duty to overthrow that government and create a government that would adhere to the terms of the contract, so to speak, the so-called social contract. That paragraph, most of us know, has become the Declaration of Independence. It's the Declaration we all know. Many of us in school had to memorize that paragraph. The reality is that that paragraph received almost no attention in Congress during the debates and the approval process for the Declaration of Independence. It was considered background, context for the case that Jefferson was making for independence. The case were the various charges of violations to those principles that both Parliament and the King were guilty of. To say that the Constitution of the United States of 1788, 1787, 1788 was written in order to implement the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is to say that the philosophy in the Declaration of Independence was the principal thrust of the document. That is absolutely not true. It received almost no attention in Congress. It was considered to be background. In fact, when Jefferson says that the truths spelled out in that paragraph are self-evident, basically what he's saying is these are things that all thinking, educated people know that government, Republican government, needs to be about. So Jefferson was not saying anything new in that document at all. In 1825, a year before Jefferson was to die, on July 4th, 1826, the same day that John Adams died, as of course many of you know, on the 8th of May, 1825, 14 months before he was to die, Jefferson wrote his longtime friend, Richard Henry Lee. And in that letter, he revisited the object of the Declaration. He reminded Richard Henry Lee about the debates of the Declaration and about what it was he was trying to do. Jefferson says in the letter to Lee that his intent was not to find new principles or to say things that had never been said before. Rather, Jefferson said, quote, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. He reassured Lee that he copied this document from no one, and that it was intended to be an expression of the American mind. What Jefferson is saying to Richard Henry Lee in 1825 is that his purpose in the Declaration of Independence was to state things that everybody already believed. State things that people already knew. Things that were, quote, self-evident truths. If that's true, then there was no reason for Congress to debate that philosophy at all because it was so generally accepted, especially within the colonies that are in the process of declaring their independence. And the desire to set up republican governments, this is exactly what they all believed. The debate between them was, do you need a strong central government to do that, or can you do it with the states being sovereign? And the states won out in the 1770s. But the nationalists won out 10 years later, thanks to the efforts of Madison, Hamilton, and the other Federalists, so-called. The point that I want to make, and we're getting right towards the top of our first hour here. In fact, we've just gone beyond it, so I'll pause momentarily here and take our 5-minute break. But what I wanted to say here is the most important thing is, in order for conservatives today to argue that the Constitution of the United States was written principally to implement the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, is to say that the philosophy of the Declaration was the most important part of it. And the evidence suggests that that is not true. Most of the debate over the Declaration of Independence revolved around the specific allegations, the specific charges of violations of the so-called British Constitution that Parliament and the King were guilty of. So what I'm saying is that the direct link between Constitution and Declaration of Independence that conservatives argue today was not. In our second hour, when we come back after a short break, we'll get into the reasons why conservatives continue to insist that the two documents are intricately and directly linked together. Given the political agenda of conservatives today, it is absolutely imperative that they retain and maintain and strengthen the connection between those two documents. In effect, in order to do that, they have to rewrite history. And when we come back, we'll see that indeed they have done that. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We will take a break. It's just gone beyond the top of our first hour. It's about 2 minutes after the hour of 3 in the East. We'll take a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to our second hour on this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is 8 minutes after the hour of 2 in the East, so we have about 45 or 47 minutes or so of program left today. It is a pleasure to be with you. If you are just joining us, welcome to the Virtual Center. You probably are aware that we've been not on the air for the last week and a half, close to 2 weeks. I believe it's exactly 2 weeks. But we are back now, and we will be back with you the first of the week on Monday. I want to welcome you. If you've been with us through the first hour, I want to thank you with us for being with us. And actually, I want to share with you a piece that I've written which kind of summarizes what we did in the first hour. So for those of you who were with us the first hour, it kind of puts a lot of that into perspective. It kind of brings a whole lot of it together, I hope. And for those of you who could not be with us during our first hour, it kind of provides the kind of review or background that will give you an opportunity to kind of join in there with us as we continue to pursue this story of the relationship that exists or does not exist between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. We do invite your active participation in the program. We have a phone number. We'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on some of these issues. Our number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate your thoughts and your ideas directly with me via email, I'll do the very best I can to respond to you. My email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. waobrien906 at gmail.com. And again, I remind you that we do have a Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you'll gain access to our Facebook page. And very honestly, the first couple of paragraphs of the material that I'll be sharing with you in a moment, I did put on the Facebook page earlier on as an introduction to this material. And because the first part, I believe, is background. And the idea was to try to give people some idea as to where we would be going if they tuned into the Virtual Center. And so some of this is background. Some of it may be material that some of you have heard before or mentioned before. So I won't spend a lot of time on it because much of it summarizes issues that we just addressed during our first hour. So again, I would love to hear from you on this. And this is the article, if you will, that I have submitted for publication to the Charleston Gazette in Charleston, West Virginia. It has not yet been published. I'm hoping that it will be. And the Gazette has adopted or established a pattern. Most of the things that I have submitted have been printed on Sundays. And I think the Sunday edition of the paper is much more accommodating to lengthy pieces of analysis and history and those kinds of things. It seems like the Sunday editions of the Gazette seem to have the most of the commentary on issues of the day and issues of the past, and that's where much of the material that I have submitted so far has been published. So I'm guessing that if that pattern stays true to form, if and when this piece appears in the Gazette, it'll be probably on a Sunday. But again, it'll probably be a few weeks hence because again, I did have a piece published in the middle of last month. So my guess is that we would have to go pretty far into the month of September before they would choose to print another piece. But anyway, so some of this material might be familiar to you, but again, what I was trying to do was lead into the story that we just shared in our first hour together in today's program. I've entitled this piece, "The Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution, an Imperfect Symmetry." And again, what I'm doing is questioning the direct connection between the two documents, and I'm hoping that I'm able to make that case. I began with a quote from one of the world's most noted poets, William Butler Yeats, and this excerpt goes as follows: "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." Yeats could well have been describing America's political scene today in 2015. A nation ideologically split asunder. Neither side willing to concede much to the other. Efforts to reach across the aisle cause for scorn and derision. Reflection and deliberation, grounds for suspicion. Negotiation and compromise, signs of weakness and lack of principle. if the ability of the center to hold in today's us versus them world was ever in question anywhere, it's here, now. A key part of the campaign to whittle down the size of the center rests upon two issues. First, rewriting the nation's history to make sure the past justifies the right present. And two, finding ways to codify that past as official by suppressing the alternatives. That means enlisting the founders with new evidence for rather dubious claims to their allegiance, in order to rewrite the past, in order to fit their agenda, and in order to ensure that the way they interpret the past becomes the official way of interpreting the past. Part of their effort has to be to suppress other options, other alternatives. Translation: if you say it loud enough and often enough, people will begin to accept it as truth. What I am in essence saying here is that there has been a conscious effort underway to rewrite America's past in order to justify the priorities of certain groups in the present. And part of that rewriting involves the founders. And more specifically, that means that you have to make sure that what you claim the founders are about matches what you're about. You have to go back and cherry pick the founders in order to make sure that what they are telling us is what we want them to believe today. Nowhere is this struggle for the nation's ideological soul more intense than efforts to secure command of its first principles by appropriating the nation's core documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. America's creed, the very essence of its being, conservatives insist, is enshrined in one small section of Jefferson's Declaration. There, government's power is limited to protecting the unalienable rights of its citizens. Nothing more, nothing less. The Constitution, man's best effort to design and fine-tune a political structure defined by that same creed, is best understood as an ingenious, albeit imperfect, means to secure a more perfect end. Always, its sense is defined by the noble purpose for which it was created, to make certain that essentials of the creed are protected, perhaps strengthened, but never compromised. To raise questions about that creed, and that's what I'm doing here, that's what we're doing here at the Virtual Center. To raise questions about that creed is not necessarily to disparage its substance or its worth, but to correct the historical record and call attention to serious dangers in efforts to enshrine it as creed. It is my sense that this idea that the creed, which is the paragraph about self-evident truths, To claim that as the creed for the nation is to claim that the founders saw it as the most important part of the Declaration. That is not true. What that means is that those who insist upon that are rewriting the past. They are putting words in the mouths of the members of the Continental Congress who approved the Declaration of Independence, because those folks paid almost no attention to this particular paragraph, but spent most of their time on the body of the Declaration, which was a series of specific allegations against the Crown. Next week here at the Virtual Center, I want to go into that portion of the Declaration. Why? Because, to be very honest, nobody ever does. I would suggest that most of us have never even read that portion of the Declaration, which they considered to be its most important part. We have made this paragraph the most important part. It has become our creed. But to imply or to say that they wanted it that way is to assert something that historically is not valid. In fact, in our first hour, I shared with you a letter from Thomas Jefferson written to Richard Henry Lee 1 year before he died, in which Jefferson reminded Lee of as to what the Declaration was really all about. And Jefferson said, we didn't set out to write anything new or to say anything that hadn't already been said before. What we were trying to do was make a statement in order to capture the sense of the American mind. In other words, what is it everybody who knows believes? What is it most people believe about people and their rights and their relationship to government and the rest of it? Jefferson didn't believe that he was inventing anything. He believed he was stating self-evident truths. So the question, of course, then becomes, how did it become America's creed? And the answer to that question is that it was Abraham Lincoln, a century later, who transformed these first principles into what has become America's creed. It's not without cause, then, that today's conservatives insist that Lincoln be included as one of the nation's founding fathers, because Lincoln was responsible for resurrecting the Declaration of Independence from the dust and the archives of the past and converting it into the creed of his present, which was 1860s, late 1850s and 1860s, when the nation was focused on the institution of slavery. There's no question that what Lincoln saw in the Declaration of Independence was the justification for the war on slavery, the freeing of the slaves, the abolition of the institution, and the acknowledgement and recognition that all men are created equal and all men are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that government has a responsibility to protect those rights. Lincoln resurrected the Declaration of Independence, the philosophy behind it, in order to meet the needs of his day. Today's conservatives choose to keep alive that creed in order to meet the needs of their day. which is small government, protection of private property, the worshiping of success and competition, and the implication that what Jefferson called the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence is nothing but a nice way of saying that man's pursuit of his own self-interest is man's nature. It's what man is all about. That's the conservative agenda of today's world. In order to justify it, they went back to when Lincoln made it the creed of the day for his world. But they've even gone further than that. They've taken Lincoln in the 1860s and they've projected him all the way back to Jefferson. And they insist that Jefferson believed, and the people who approved the Declaration of Independence believed, that this creed was really what the Declaration of Independence was all about. And once they believe that they are able to establish that, then they can legitimately bring the Constitution into the picture and claim that government was created to protect people's natural rights, unalienable rights,
Unfortunately, I have lost my connection to Dr. Bill because the computer on which he comes into the program chose to restart itself, even though I told it not to do so for another 4 hours. Thanks, Microsoft. So until it restarts, we'll be on hold. Stand by, please. Thank you. After a brief interruption brought to you by the fine folks at Frontier Communications, here's Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. I really apologize for that interruption. We had the entire system decided to reboot in the middle of the program, and I'm sorry that it happened. But anyway, I'm not exactly sure where we were when we went off. So let me go back to the paper that we were taking this from and basically revisit where we were and see if we can go on. We've still got 17, 18 minutes left in today's program. What we were talking about is raising questions about the legitimacy of the Declaration of Independence philosophy as America's creed. And the point that I was making was that particular creed we owe to Abraham Lincoln 100 years later, who resurrected the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence in order to justify America's war to end slavery. And so basically the creed of the Declaration became useful to Abraham Lincoln in the 1850s and 1860 to legitimize the war on slavery. And Lincoln's resurrection of the philosophy of the Declaration as America's creed is useful to conservatives today because it fits their particular agenda in today's world. But as I was mentioning, not only have these folks revisited Lincoln, but they have also projected Lincoln's position that the philosophy of the Declaration is indeed America's creed. They have projected that all the way back into the 18th century, into the Continental Congress that adopted the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, there is no historical justification for that, because this particular portion of the Declaration received almost no attention by the Congress. It was indeed a statement of self-evident truths, as Jefferson, in his 1825 letter to Richard Henry Lee, asserted that it was. The relevant paragraph at the outset of the Declaration, Jefferson believed, was an effort to capture the essence of what he called the American mind. This is what Americans who supported the idea of Republican government believed the relationship between government and its people was all about. In 1776, when the Declaration was written, this was used as background to Jefferson's case for independence, which is the bulk of the Declaration. And I had mentioned, I believe before we went off, that I'd like to go to that portion of the Declaration in our programming next week and look at some of the basis of the case that Jefferson made, because I know that that's a portion of the Declaration that few people read, because we've been told that it's really the unimportant part. The only important part of the Declaration is the philosophy, when in fact the record indicates that the philosophy was not considered that important at all in the 18th century. Only Lincoln made it so. Let me share with you a couple of excerpts from Abraham Lincoln to indicate his thinking when he chose to revisit the Declaration of Independence. In a speech in Peoria, Illinois in 1854, that's 6 years before Lincoln is elected president, Lincoln is in his speech taking a position against the institution of slavery. And he says the following: "Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it, the practices and policy which harmonize with it. Let North and South, let all America, let all lovers of liberty everywhere join in the great and good work. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but shall have so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. We shall have so saved it that the succeeding millions of free, happy people the world over shall rise up and call us blessed to the next generation." Here, then, is Lincoln's effort to resurrect the Declaration and make it the philosophy not only within America, but the philosophy of the world. It obviously is the same philosophy that has justified American foreign policy ever since. It's very important, and it's very important that we know where it came from. In Springfield, in a speech during the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1857, Lincoln made the following statement: "The Declaration's signers meant simply to declare the right, so that enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which would be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere." This is Lincoln's statement as to what the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence can mean if we'll use it. It becomes the mission of the nation. It's a worldwide mission. The assertion that all men are created equal was of no practical use in effecting our separation from Great Britain. And it was placed in the Declaration not for that, but for future use. Its authors meant it to be, as, thank God, it is now proving itself, a stumbling block to all those who in after times might seek to turn a free people back into the hateful paths of despotism. Unquote. Notice Lincoln's rationale here. Since the statement that all men are created equal is in the Declaration, and since Lincoln says it played no part whatever in America's right to be independent from Great Britain, then his conclusion is the only reason that Jefferson put it in was for future use, so that we could go back to it now and use it for the particular case that we need to make now. That is projecting meaning back into the minds of the founders that was not initially there. And then finally, in 1860, on the train, on his way to Washington, Lincoln says the following: the revolution, was not the mere matter of separation of the colonies from the motherland, but of that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence which gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to all the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weights would be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. This is the sentiment embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Basically, then, what Lincoln is saying in these speeches is that the Declaration of Independence espoused a philosophy which had no meaning at the time it was written, therefore must only have been there so that we could use it now. That's the same rationale that conservatives are using today in asserting the direct link between the Declaration and the Constitution of the United States. And this is the second point that I make in raising questions about the creed as creed. To see the Declaration of Independence as creed is erroneously to affix the Constitution to it. It is to view the Constitution as means to an end, as the structural muscle necessary to enact and enforce dogma. And that's not what the Constitution was written about at all. It was written to replace the Articles of Confederation, which was the form of government that reflected the spirit of the Declaration. So what I've said then is that resolution of this dilemma between the Constitution and the Declaration, if there is one, must begin with the founders. If indeed we are to resolve the problem or the controversy between the degree to which the Declaration and the Constitution are related, we have to go back to the founders to do it. We have to look at the history. And then, of course, it seems to me, we get into the Constitution itself. If these folks are claiming that the Constitution's purpose is to implement the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, then we are left to explain or try to explain the content of the Constitution, because it doesn't match. There's nothing in the Constitution about unalienable rights. There's no mention of a creator. In fact, the entire Constitution is based on the idea that after the social contract, man's rights become civil rights. No longer are they unalienable rights. Man's rights are linked to the definition of the public interest for society at a particular point in time. They are not inalienable. They are not absolute. The Declaration says they are. The two documents are in conflict, not symmetry. Back to a paragraph from the Constitution, actually from Madison's Federalist Number 10 about the Constitution. And this is the one which speaks to man's nature. This is the one where Madison says, quote, "Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority." This, I've said, is one of the most poignant sentences in Madison's Federalist Number 10. It is frequently cited as proof of Madison's negative reading of human nature, quite consistent with the many people who trace man's fall from grace to Adam's original sin. If men were angels, Madison wrote in Federalist 51, no government would be necessary at all. For government is the greatest of all reflections on human nature, unquote. On first reading, this paragraph about the complaints of our most considerate and virtuous citizens tells us that there's serious danger in the nation from an out-of-control, overbearing majority that's able to dominate rivalries between hostile parties to its own advantage. Most people would subscribe rather quickly to Madison's search for a cure. We know, of course, that the Constitution is that cure. But wait, there's a problem. There's more here than meets the eye. Just who are these most considerate and virtuous citizens? Clearly, they're society's best people. Madison vouches for them by assuring us of their support for public and private faith and public and personal liberty, whatever that is. Clearly, these folks matter, and they're upset. 18th century parlance, 18th century meaning, English, tells us that faith, as used here, meant personal responsibility, meeting your private obligations, your debts, and your public obligations, your taxes. Those, then, who have Madison's ear, those doing the complaining, are the creditors to whom unpaid debts were owed and tax collections obligated. These, then, are the minority rights that are being violated. And the pure democracy Madison so attacks is happening in legislatures instructed by hard-pressed majorities to enact fiscal relief measures in violation of public and private contracts. It's clear that the Constitution that Madison is promoting here has little at all to do with the creed ascribed to Jefferson in 1776. Philosophically, the Constitution was the very antithesis of the natural rights philosophy conservative scholars insist was embedded in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. It was the Articles, not the Constitution, that truly embodied the spirit of 1776. This was the brand of republicanism, devoid of the civic virtue so essential to its existence, that was responsible for what Madison called the instability, injustice, and confusion in the public councils that have in truth been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished. It was then the disease for which the Constitution would be the cure. Translation: there's nothing here in the Constitution's ability to establish control over the runaway majority rule that's happening in the states. There's nothing in it that relates to the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the two documents are the exact opposite of each other. Because Jefferson's idea that all men are created equal and have absolute or unalienable rights to this, that, and the other thing is absolutely opposite to what Madison is saying here in Federalist number 10 as to why we need the Constitution of the United States. But there's more. Unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time. We have reached 58 minutes after the hour. I apologize again for the 10-minute delay we had in the midst of this, our second hour. I do invite you to be with us when we come back here for the Virtual Center on next Monday at our regular time, 1 p.m. in the East. We'll have our full 2-hour program, and we'll begin by revisiting this and addressing specifically the question: if history is so opposite to what today's conservatives are trying to say, why do they insist on continuing to push it? We'll take on that question next time. This is Bill O'Brien. I want to thank you so much for your willingness to hang in there with the Virtual Center and with the folks at the Head On Radio Network. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I hope you have a wonderful week. It looks like the weather as we move into this coming weekend is going to be superb. And I invite you to tune in again here at the Virtual Center for the study of the Constitution and civic responsibility. Thank you.